This lecture will cover the 17th century in Italy, particularly covering painting, and look at the rise of a new style at the outset of the century, which will emphasize engagement with the viewer, theatricality, and ensuring that this drama is going to bring us in both and engage with us physically and emotionally and spiritually. All right, so we find that the impetus for this style comes from and out of that incredibly erudite and complex style where we left off Italy in the 16th. Now, the period under investigation now in the 17th century is known as the Age of Absolutism, namely because of the Sun King who will come to power by mid-century, Louis XIV, and will establish a new type of rule where the king is the ultimate authority without checks and balances. And so therefore France will become the most powerful and wealthy nation in Europe. And we find in this century Spain will be the poorest nation after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 by the English Navy. The English are going to build new cathedrals, yet their artworks remain primarily in the genre of portraiture, so we do not have a very rich tradition at this time in that country. And you find that the 17th century is going to, at the outset, be marred by the 30 Years' War between France and England and Spain. So these three nations will constantly be in conflict, drawing mercenary soldiers from the Germanic states of the Holy Roman Empire. Out of this conflict and reshaping of Europe, you're going to have a new style, which comes to be known as the Baroque. Now, the Baroque, we believe, comes from a Portuguese word for misshapen pearl, barroco. And if you look in the dictionary today for the definition of the Baroque, it also reflects that rather pejorative interpretation, just like Impressionism is also going to be a negative, a pejorative term used to describe works of art. In this case, the Baroque is considered overtly or overly grotesque or ornamented, if you look at the definition. And certainly by the end of the century, the techniques used by various artists to draw us into these stories, generally religious subjects, do use many different techniques that can be considered overly ornate. Now, why did the Baroque develop to begin with? Well, if you look at the state of art in Italy, where the Papal States and Catholicism is going to be housed and where the headquarters are located, we find that the Maniera will dominate the later 1500s after the Protestant Reformation takes full effect by mid-century, and we see the Catholic anxiety or response to this shifting of the religious world to a new version of Christianity. So the style, such as seen here with Bronzino's Exposure of Luxury that we looked at, is defined by its complexity, both in subject matter, in organization, in how erudite one must be and well-read to understand it. You find that the subjects never easily give themselves up for interpretation, but instead remain obscured behind layers of literary or theoretical or allegorical covering. So, with the Council of Trent that was assembled by Paul III, the Pope who commissioned Michelangelo to finish the Sistine Chapel with the Last Judgment, he assembles a series of meetings in the northern Italian city of Trent between 1545 and 63, where church officials are going to discuss and address the concerns brought up by Martin Luther in the 95 Theses and decide what to do about the Protestant Reformation. Thus, what comes out of the Council of Trent and post-Tridentine Catholicism, as you might know it, is going to be the Counter or Catholic Reformation, as it has become known today. That being the Catholic response to the Reformation, trying to win back all of the souls that were lost in the mid-16th century, and to address the concerns and the perceived abuses in the church. Now, when it comes to art, the subject at hand here, we find that one of those in attendance, Archbishop Gabriele Peliotti, is going to be the Archbishop of Bologna, and he writes a treatise addressing what should be done about art. Well, the Council of Trent in the very last session in 1563 reiterated the belief going back to Pope Gregory, in the 8th century, that images are the Bible for the illiterate. They teach us how to live our lives by giving us examples from the lives of the saints, of Christ, and other holy figures. Now, Peliotti is going to emphasize that in moving away from the Mannerist idiom and moving away from this complexity that defines it, that first and foremost, art needs to be clear. We need a clarity of subject. We need to know what exactly is being communicated. Is it a crucifixion? Is it an adoration? Is it an annunciation? We need to know, which leads us to the second point he has, that being an accuracy of narrative must be paramount. That being, we need to include figures that belong in the scene. We need not bring in dress, clothing, or other personages that were not part of the biblical account, for instance, that just confuses the average viewer. And finally, the whole point of art to begin with is to stimulate people to piety or to religious acts, to live a more righteous life, right? So this is what art is supposed to do in the end. And how do we convince people of that? By developing a new that's actually going to come out of the very city Peliotti is going to be living in and publishing in, and that is Bologna. So in Bologna, we have a group of artists that found an academy in 1583 that is going to address and attempt to rectify a lot of the issues with art that were identified in the Council of Trent and that were laid out by Archbishop Gabriele Peliotti, their very own Archbishop from Bologna. So we find that Ludovico, Annibale, and Agostino Carracci are all going to return in their studies and training a whole new generation that will come to dominate the art world in the first quarter of the 17th century, that the style is going to be founded in careful observation of nature and life study, that they're going to look at northern examples and develop a type of Baroque naturalism that is direct, that is relatable, that once again is clear in its. Where do they get that idea? Well, they send themselves and their pupils to study throughout the north, throughout Verona, throughout the Veneto, Venice, looking at artists like Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto, and looking at how they're going to draw in their audience with dramatic compositions built around diagonals, with dramatic lighting, through color relationships, and all of this for the emotional response of the viewer, not an intellectual response. Now, taking these early advances and discoveries from earlier Venetian masters, the Carracci and this burgeoning Baroque style will be brought to Rome under the auspice of Eduardo Farnese, who wants the Carracci to decorate his palace. So in the Palazzo Farnese, we have a ceiling painting that is designed to compete with the Sistine Chapel. So ever since the Sistine Chapel was completed in 1512, everyone has wanted, that being wealthy patrons across Europe, have also wanted their own Sistine Chapel, their own interior painted space, generally barrel vaulted, that is going to glorify generally a family who commissions it. And that's what we have here with the Palazzo Farnese and the Farnese Gallery as it is known. Now, this is where we find the Carracci being influenced by the classical art that they come across in Rome. And this becomes known as Baroque classicism. So the classical approach here will idealize forms filtered through the ancient models of the ancient statuary collection that the Farnese were famous for. So it is in the very hall the very gallery where visitors would come to marvel at the wonderful collection the Farnese had, that you would look up and see paintings on the ceiling, these fictive paintings that would be inspired by antiquity because they are all mythological or pagan subjects. In the series of paintings above, which are all quadri riportati, or paintings that look like easel paintings carried up onto the ceiling. So these are all fictive paintings with many layers of fiction meant to compete with the Sistine Chapel, who had several layers of fiction with nudes or the nudi surrounding these architectural features that are illusionistic and finally framing these biblical scenes. Here, the scenes are not taken from the Bible, but instead all derived from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So Ovid's Metamorphoses is the collection in ancient Rome of all of the most important mythological stories brought together for an entertaining purpose for the Roman population. So here, the themes taken from Ovid are all going to relate, as one might guess with metamorphosis, it's where things change, to amor vinxit omnia, or love conquers all. So in the scenes, all of them relate to the loves of the gods, demigods, and mortals, and how love will make fools of us all, controlling even the most powerful gods and demigods. In the center, we see that the entire gallery is going to be centered around the Bacchanalia and or the triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne, where the god of wine finds his bride, who he falls in love with immediately and marries, Ariadne, the princess who's the daughter of King Minos, who was left on the island of Naxos, abandoned by Theseus to head back to Athens, left to die. Luckily, Bacchus, with his entourage, right, of all of these various satyrs, his cheetah chariot, and other figures are going to be drunkenly stammering about, celebrating the newfound love of the god of wine with his new wife, who he will turn into and transform into a constellation, hence the crown of stars that's being placed ahead. Now, the organization is taken from those Roman sarcophagi that were in abundance and in the collection of families like the Farnese, where we have a clear progression from left to right, with monumental figures right behind the picture plane, clearly gesturing, gesticulating, and letting us know of their psychological state and comportment. Looking closely at the figures of Bacchus and Ariadne themselves, you can see how they are based on a bright local color palette and the filtering through antique models, because in the arm and shoulder of Ariadne, you see the same interest in these classicizing forms that Michelangelo had displayed on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, whereby we have ideal forms that are going to be shown filtered through a very bulky, muscular Hellenistic sculpture. Now, combining this Roman interest with classical statuary with the Venetian interactive interest in drama and drawing an audience into the story that you're telling, we have a great example here that will be very important for later artists like Bernini and his statues of David and interactivity as well. Here, with the painting at the very end of the gallery of Polyphemus Furioso, we have a scene that follows Polyphemus enamored, or innamorato, where the enraged, one-eyed Cyclops and son of Poseidon is going to have fallen in love with a beautiful sea nymph named Galatea. But unbeknownst to him, she already had a teenage lover named Arcus. Upon discovering them together, Polyphemus is going to pick up a boulder and hurl it at the couple, crushing the young Arcus to death. As you can see them fleeing here, trying to cover or shield themselves on the right. Now, the hypertrophied musculature that we see in Polyphemus is actually based on the statue in this very collection seen below, the famous Farnese Heracles, which was in the family's collection, and the people come from all over Europe to study this, to copy it, to sketch it, and make prints after it. So this massive 10-foot, 4-inch tall statue of Heracles is the perfect model for the behemoth, the over life-size rendition here of Polyphemus, the ferocious cyclops that will devour Odysseus's men in the Odyssey. Now, the positioning of the figures, even though Polyphemus is modeled on its late classical predecessor, it is not engaging in necessarily the same way. Instead, we have a very dramatic here that is based around a series of diagonals and counter diagonals that ensure we immediately recognize that the figures are in motion, in action, and that's why they use diagonal compositions in the Baroque. So you'll notice that the entire body of Polyphemus, right, is going to have one large diagonal that sweeps from the upper left to the lower right of the composition. And then a counter diagonal can be seen in the body of Acchus, who runs away in terror. In addition to that, we find this Baroque interactivity with the spectator and its interest in drama is going to be shown in an increased attempt to break the picture plane and physically engage with us. So we find that if you follow the swing of Polyphemus, who must swing around in order to release the boulder towards the fleeing figures, that he must break the picture plane. He must come out into our space in order to complete his swing and kill the young Acchus. And so we become engaged with what is happening because we're not only sympathetic to the plight of the broken-hearted Cyclops and the poor, horrified figures who did not understand what transgression awaited them, but we also are physically engaged with what's happening because the boulder's coming out at us, much like a three-dimensional movie. Now, the artist that will be the primary competition in Rome in the early 17th century for Annibale Carracci and his followers is Caravaggio. So Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio is very famous today for his biography and for what we know about his life, a very violent one, because he was a murderer. He was going to be convicted of homicide. He's going to flee his hometown of Rome, where he lives and works, and is going to be hunted by bounty hunters, only to die miserably on a beach. He's going to famously quarrel with individuals, be thrown in jail repeatedly, always on trial. So it's appropriate that with his biography, he develops a very dramatic stage lighting called tenebroso, an exaggerated form of chiaroscuro, or light and shade. In this instance, it is a lighting that restricts to the brightest highlights and deepest shadows, right, these tonal variations, to where one comes out dramatically from a black background. He will combine this interest in tenebrism with Baroque naturalism, where he carefully studies plebeian types, unidealized forms, and combines them with brutally real scenes. And this is what he is known for, his brutal realism. Now, turning to Caravaggio's first public commission in San Luigi dei Francesi, you're going to have an example of your reformatory appeal to senses, that being in the Baroque, as laid out by Peliotti and as practiced by the Carracci, they believe that we can more easily communicate the message of the church and bring people back to Catholicism and back to the church if we are going to present them in a very contemporary way, in a relatable way to people, and show figures in a very naturalistic setting. Things that we can all relate to, thus making the message of Catholicism and of Christianity relevant to all of us. And that is true here with the calling of St. Matthew in the Contarelli Chapel for the patron whose name also is Matthew. Thus we have scenes from the life of St. Matthew, who was was a tax collector that was called to be one of the apostles and follow Christ. So Matthew will also become the most scientific of the apostles, and he's going to write the most detailed account in his Gospels of Christ's life and passion. So in this painting, we have a group of figures in contemporary attire seated at the foreground left, with the large puffy sleeves, wearing a rapier, with feathers in their caps, with bright colors, all common in contemporary dress at the time. This is what you would see with young men about town dressed in their finest attire. Now, the figures also include plebeian types in that they are not idealized. That being, we have wrinkles and suntans and dirty fingernails, and all of it lit by a cellar light from the upper right-hand corner, illuminating the exterior of this tavern and this window. We see the shutters here are actually open, so we're on the outside of a tavern, where these tax collectors have just collected their money and are being interrupted by the two figures dressed in biblical garb, ancient garb. Now you notice that the gesture of St. Peter, who accompanies Christ, he imitates the finger pointing towards St. Matthew, who in turn points towards his chest, as though to say, "Who, me?" And we find that the repeated gestures are going to relate the light. The sliver of the halo is the only indication that anything spiritual is happening in this painting above Christ's head. And so we find that the light represents the truth of God's message as it is falling upon St. Matthew, who sees him, while the other figures do not look up. Many of them continue to focus on the materialistic aspects of life, counting money, not seeing the importance of spirituality and God who beckons them to come to him. Now, the hand of Christ, people who are very knowledgeable and have seen all of the great works in Rome, would have immediately noted that the hand is a limp-fingered rendition reminiscent of Adam and the creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel. Now we find that it is going to be on the hand of Christ. Appropriate and a clever typological reference used by Caravaggio here, because Christ is considered to be the new Adam. Hence, we are to think of the most famous Adam in Rome on the Sistine Chapel, and also that Christ will redeem mankind because Adam causes sin, right, in the first part of. In addition, we find that Michelangelo is actually Caravaggio's name, and we know that his father named him as such because of his affinity for the 16th century sculptor who painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So Caravaggio, we are told, always had an inferiority complex, trying to compare himself to the great Michelangelo, and here, seemingly, he's asking us to do just that. Compare his approach to that of Michelangelo's, to see which is. Now, where did he get this idea of having figures dressed in contemporary, everyday attire and bringing in medieval symbolic elements as well? And that is, it's common in the North with the development of genre scenes in painting, in which we show, again, everyday elements and scenes, people in contemporary dress, yet we have a moralizing overtone and a religious interpretation that's going to already be well established in the North. Caravaggio merely brings it to Rome as a new device for affecting people and bringing them back. Now, the followers of the Carracci and Caravaggio continue in their idioms and are going to develop and spread this style. In the case of Artemisia Genileschi, we have a Caravaggista, or a follower of Caravaggio, practicing a style of Caravaggio, that of Caravaggismo. And so this Caravaggista is going to take the plebeian types, the straightforward representations, the naturalistic approach, and the brutal naturalism practiced by Caravaggio. And So in paintings like Judith beheading Holofernes, we have a very popular scene from the Old Testament where, in the book of Judith, the Assyrian general of Nebuchadnezzar is sent to besiege the Israelite city of Bethulia, where the beautiful widow Judith is going to live. And while the men do not know what to do about the situation, she is going to seduce this general and is going to sneak into his tent at night with her maidservant, get him intoxicated, get him drunk, and seduce him, and then with his own sword decapitate him. Now this is a scene that Caravaggio himself had painted earlier. Again, we have the dramatic tenebroso or tenebrism, the very black backgrounds, the stark highlights, the bright highlights, the deep shadows, where we're going to find this drama playing out. In Caravaggio's version, we have the figures organized into a standard figure 8 composition, where we see the maidservant, who is an old hag in this instance, next to a young, beautiful Judith, while she is pulling the hair of Holofernes back as he screams in horror, realizing he's being decapitated, while we find this orange-red blood is going to stream onto the pillow. Now, this composition of a figure 8 is very graceful and emphasizes the feminine grace and beauty that Judith is going to possess. Now, if you look at Artemisia Genileschi's approach, given that she is barred from male nude life study, she hides the body of Holofernes quite convincingly, as she's going to foreshorten his form and that of the maidservant, thus drawing our attention to the center, the main point, reinforcing what is happening, and that is the hilt of the sword, as she is hacking her way through the neck of Holofernes. You'll notice that all of the visual weight is pressing on his head, that is right up against the picture plane. When we see the head completely severed, it will roll out into our space. Even the expressions of the different Judiths here are going to be informative of the approach of these artists, in that, sure, they do seem to be naturalistic, but Gentileschi's Judith is much more believable in her intent to complete the decapitation. Right? She does not seem squeamish and or taken aback by the grotesque horror before. And if you compare the elements of horror that are meant to shock us, it is certainly going to be Gentileschi who very carefully observed butcher shops to get the arterial spray down of the blood that seeps into the bed sheets and stains them. Hers is going to be a scene that ensures that we are engaged in this dramatic event, as the head will literally roll out towards us, just like the boulder of Polyphemus or the glass of wine. Now, later in the century, this interest in drama and theatricality is going to find spectacular results in ceiling painting, carrying on the tradition of Michelangelo and then Annibale Carracci. Here, in the Palazzo Barberini, we're going to have a very influential ceiling painting by Pietro da Cortona, or Peter from Cortona, literally, in the glorification of the reign of Urban VIII, otherwise known as the Allegory of Divine Providence. And in it we have a massive ceiling painting on a barrel vault that is a quadratura. So in a quadratura we find that fictive architecture is going to be illusionistically painted and carried upwards beyond the limits of the wall, and in this case opens up into the sky itself, where dozens of figures are going to pile in and out of the space, right? Easily moving into the space of this room and out again, beyond into. So this is the opposite of the quadro riportato that we're going to find Annibale Carracci designing the Farnese Gallery after, because this is going to instead open up as though the sky itself and the architecture itself extends beyond the border of the surface of the wall. Now, this illusionistic effect is going to take a wonderful toll on the viewer and impress upon the viewer that all of these allegorical figures, again, they're not literal, they all represent ideas such as religion or the papacy or divine providence herself, are all going to be sharply below, as though we see the figures from below, taking our vantage point into consideration, like that of Correggio's Assumption of the Virgin, or later the Titian works, and that of Tintoretto, for instance. So here in a dal sotto in su, which is a from below up, or a worm's eye view, we connect with the figures from below as they are sharply foreshortened, and we must stand in a particular spot in this room, in the salone, in order for all of these figures to snap into focus, for this illusion to be effective. Thus these figures fly. So Baroque art in general, we might state, due to the Counter Reformation and the desire to bring people back to Catholicism, is going to engage the spectator emotionally, physically, and most importantly, spiritually. They believed that by using directly relatable figures that one sees on a daily basis, that are going to violently engage with one another and draw us in, that we would then be taught a spiritual lesson and would be moved to spirituality much more effectively. This lecture continues the 17th century in Italy by looking at architecture and sculpture, building upon the innovations first seen in painting, especially with the Carracci followed by Caravaggio, an interest that comes to dominate art in all media throughout Europe thanks to the Catholic Reformation or Counter Reformation in response to Protestantism that seeks to bring people back to the Catholic Church by way of dynamic, exciting, and engaging work. Thus physically, spiritually, and emotionally engaging viewers. This is going to be seen as well in architecture. Now, beginning with architecture, we have the completion of the actual structure in the Vatican, known as New St. Peter's, at the outset of the 17th century, thanks to the Borghese Pope Paul V. So Paul V hired Carlo Maderno to complete the front of the cathedral as we see it today, with the facade, including the classical temple front, and continuing from around the back, Michelangelo's tripartite division with the lower section of giant columns, the entablature, and then the attic story. Now, of course, St. Peter's did not look like this when construction began at the turn of the century. We find that with the sack of Rome in 1527 and the crisis in Europe of Protestantism, according to the Catholics, construction on St. Peter's largely halted. So we find that only part of the basilica was actually demolished at Julius II's demand and reconstructed after Bramante's design and then Michelangelo's design. And so you can see here by these drawings that the original gatehouse is going to remain standing by 1538, shortly after the sack of Rome. By 1575, you see the base of the dome completed, but still the old wooden basilica and the facade remaining. In 1611, you see here a flurry of activity taking place as the dome is completed, with these workers living in these shanty towns out front, with marble strewn about where the piazza. Now, it was with the plan of Michelangelo that Carlo Maderno began New St. Peter's and extending the nave. For Michelangelo had taken from Bramante's design that of a Greek cross plan, with equidistant arms for the nave and the transept. Maderno kept the upper section of Michelangelo's plan and extended the nave outward, giving it again the standard Latin cross design with an elongated nave and vertical axis and orientation. So it is going to be this massive basilica that doubles in length once he is completed with it. At 730 feet long, 500 feet wide, dwarfing the original 300 30-foot-long Old St. Peter's Basilica, so over doubling the size of it. But this is the section we can attribute directly to Carlo Maderno, the papal architect under Paul V. He extended it out beyond Michelangelo's design, and so this section can be attributed to him, where he adds a nave and then a narthex, and an entryway, a vestibule, if you will, between the exterior facade and the major doors to the interior. The nave extends, thus allowing larger crowds inside of this structure, thousands of people. Originally, thousands would have fit in Old St. Peter's, but this doubles and nearly triples the capacity because we need all of these people in attendance for Mass put on by the Pope and bishops here in Rome. Now on the exterior, the massive entryway, and what people see first upon entering the piazza, walking up to and entering New St. Peter's, is the classical temple front Carlo Maderno adopts to draw your attention to the center of the structure. And remember, the classical temple front is going to include the columns, entablature, and pediment from classical antiquity. So you see the engaged columns here, these giant order columns running for more than one story, until we get to the architrave at the base of the entablature, and then the rectangular pediment above it, giving us a focal point and tying what Julius II always wanted, this new structure to ancient Rome and running across the entablature, we have, listed in Latin, in honor of the Princes of the Apostles, or Pope Paul V Borgesis Romanus, Pontifex Maximus. Right, so here, completed in 1612, we have, for all history, Paul V, right, is going to be very clearly identified as the patron for this structure, carried out by Carlo Maderno. Now, the structure and the design was continued from the back, where the apse is and the transepts, the side arms, if you will, of this Latin cross plan, which was completed by Michelangelo. And it was very unique, a very anti-classical plan, we might add, where we have a colossal or giant order of columns that move through more than one story, communicating the grandeur and the majesty, the sheer scale of the structure, terminating in an entablature at the base of an architrave, and then an additional attic story on top, taking the place of a traditional pediment or triangular section on a temple front. So continuing this, Maderno brought that design around with these flat pilasters to the front, but then is going to replace pilasters for engaged columns, stepping out towards the spectator as we approach the main entrance in the center. And this is important. At the beginning of the century, we see a gradual move in architecture to eventually engage with the spectator's space, moving out in a theatrical fashion literally into our space. In this case, very gradually you can see that it stair steps out to the greatest projection into the central piazza where the temple front is located with the name of Paul V Borghese. And so it does engage with us, but ever so gingerly, introducing us to this. Now, the completion of New St. Peter's, as we know it, actually did not occur until the second half of the 17th century with Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who's going to be hired by Alexander VII, the Chigi Pope, to complete the piazza out front and the hundreds of statues that line the facade of New St. Peter's and the piazza as well. Now, Bernini is perhaps the most successful artist in Italy at the time. He is the preeminent artist to the popes, working for a succession of popes, becoming the official papal architect, as well as getting all the best commissions in Rome. In addition to being an architect, he's probably better known worldwide as a sculptor, but was also an accomplished painter and playset designer. And he's going to bring his interest in theatricality and drama into all of these various media. Right? He's going to make stage set designs that are interactive, that are going to move and whirl and engage the audience, just as he will with architecture and sculpture. So here at the end of the century, we find the Piazza of St. Peter's being completed. So it is the highlighted area that we attribute to St. Peter, to Bernini here, completing St. Peter's, whereby we have a trapezoidal set of arms coming out from the sides of the facade designed by Maderno that open up into an oval shape, at the center of which you have the obelisk established by Domenico Fontana, showing that just like the Roman emperors before them, the popes inherit this Roman Empire, just as the earlier Roman emperors had brought these Egyptian obelisks from faraway lands, showing how far their dominion spreads. Now, at the time Bernini was given the commission for the piazza, we originally had two campanile, or extensive bell towers, on either side of the facade as designed by Maderno. These, due to the proximity to the Tiber River, had sunk and fallen over, causing extensive damage to the wings of the facade. And so you find that Bernini is going to be limited in what he can do, given that the papal apartments and the Sistine Chapel are off to the side after these campanile fell. So he had to move in, away from these holy structures that we would not dare demolish. Who would tear down the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's paintings in it? So he moves in a trapezoidal fashion the arms inward towards the center of the piazza, opens up. And so we have this wonderful concetto, or conceit, or organizing principle of the design, whereby the arms here of the piazza itself encircle it and hug and embrace the people that will gather inside, and are meant to be understood as the arms of loving Mother Church that are extending outward and bringing people into the bosom of the Church, welcoming them back from dalliances with Protestantism, for instance. Now, today we have this grand boulevard that Mussolini bulldozed down to the Tiber River, giving you direct access to the Castel San Angelo and a view directly of the river. Originally, the buildings would have butted up exactly against the edges of the entryway to this piazza, or plaza, where people gather today. So you find that at the time, you would only catch glimpses of the spectacular effect of the cathedral that awaits you once you are going to get close enough. So you would round a corner and be met with this overwhelming view of the Vatican, all in one glorious appearance. Visiting dignitaries as well, moving through the dual sets of columns off to the sides, would have only been able to see glimpses moving up to the entryway, where they would step out of their carriage and again be able to see in one complete view at one point in time, taking all of the glory of Bernini and Maderno's design in at once. And this is what is so important for understanding the Baroque, the theatrical revelation of an ideal moment, a climactic moment that is meant to overwhelm you emotionally, right, in a dramatic fashion. Now, you find that Bernini, along with his many apprentices, will complete 140 statues of over life-size saints all the way across and ringing around the interior of this piazza, much like he's going to design the angels on the bridge to the Castle San Angelo, the Ponte San Angelo, if you will, the bridge to the Castle of Saint Angel with Archangel Michael on top. Now, this interactivity, common in the Baldacchino, is going to be begun much earlier, working for the Borghese family and the cardinal nephew of Paul V. So the best sculptures we have of Bernini actually come from his early work with Scipione Borghese, who, after Paul V is going to be named Pope, is going to himself be named a cardinal, a common practice called nepotism, now famously known as putting one's relatives in power. It comes from the Italian practice and the word nipote, or nephew, Thus, anytime a pope comes to power, his nephews immediately are named cardinals and given great power and wealth. They immediately buy a palace, in this case the Borghese Palazzo, and they will decorate that palace with the most extravagant and lavish works of art, thus legitimizing the family. So this is a propaganda technique. So we have many wonderful works, Baroque works here in the Borghese Gallery. So Scipione Borghese is going to hire Bernini to live with the Borghese in particular servitude, or special servitude as it is known, like Mantegna before him, working for the Duke of Mantua, the Gonzaga. He's going to live with them. They pay a salary, and he makes whatever works that they demand. Now, in the works produced for Scipione Borghese, we have both biblical and mythological scenes. And I just want to illustrate how, in the example of Pluto and Proserpine, that we have Bernini showing us his virtuosity as a sculptor, in that he, unlike even Michelangelo, can make hard marble soft and pliable, suggesting that the soft, warm flesh of Proserpina, or Proserpine, if you want the Greek version of her name, is going to have the fingers of Pluto or Hades digging into it as she's being carried across the threshold into hell, struggling against his powerful grip. But this is what Bernini is able to do as a sculptor, just as Albrecht Dürer is going to be a virtuoso in printmaking, so too Dürer is in sculpture, and his medium that he is made famous for is marble carving, just like that of Michelangelo and Jean Bologna. In the case of Bernini's David, we have the Baroque counterpart to the two earlier Renaissance examples we saw, the early Renaissance example from Donatello, and then we have the high Renaissance example from Michelangelo. Now here with Bernini, you have the Baroque rendition, which is very appropriate and apropos, following upon the invention of an interactive approach to narrative brought forth by Annibale Carracci gallery. Now, if you compare it to the High Renaissance version, you can immediately see the difference, and the difference relates to when in the narrative this takes place. As with painting, Baroque sculpture is always going to have the point in the narrative be the climactic moment as something is occurring, not before or after. So in the case of Michelangelo's David, we see before the battle, as he eyes Goliath from across the field, preparing to engage with him, still holding the slingshot and the very stone that will crush Goliath's skull. So he is psychologically engaged with something outside of himself. In Bernini's David, we find that there is nothing intellectual or psychological about this engagement. Instead, it is entirely physical, as we see the moment he is about to release the stone, the moment he is going to be swinging backwards and releasing the stone towards the giant's forehead, aiming ever so hard. And we can see that in his face, and how he is clenching his jaw, biting his lip, narrowing his brow. So in the faces, you see the careful and concerned look of and consternation of Michelangelo's David with the furrowing brow. In the case of Bernini, you can see the careful concentration as he is doing something, the moment of an action, the jaw clenched, right? The moment that he's going to be releasing something and coming back around. Now, the idea of having a figure winding back with a projectile is not new in the history of art. In fact, it's not even necessarily Baroque or dramatic. If you look at Myron's Discobolus, for instance, or the discus thrower, you have a high classical example of a similar theme, where a figure is winding back, about to come forward and release this object. However, the difference is quite obvious between the two. Myron's Discobolus is perfectly balanced and is not going to change, will not move, as you find that he's organized around a central axis, a central vertical axis that ensures that the legs and the arm counterbalance that of the left arm and head. So we find that he is perfectly caught in that moment of pure potential of future motion, but will not move. For Bernini's example, you'll notice that from this angle, if he does not move, pivoting off with his foot and the ball of his foot, he will fall backward that just like the positioning and the pose of Annibale Carracci's Polyphemus Furioso, which is actually taken from and is modeled directly on this example that we have here, the David as well swings back with an object, pulling his left arm back and around the body, right, to his right, whereby the right leg is planted out front, pushing off with the left leg, swinging out violently, releasing something into the space between us and this imaginary Goliath that supposedly would be behind us. So whereas in Annibale Carracci, Polyphemus swings into our space but then releases it at the figure of Bacchus down to the lower right. We find that in Bernini's example of David, he will release the projectile directly out where we are. This is a life-size figure, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and we are standing right in front of him. So people, since its unveiling in 1623, have said that they felt as though they should get out of the way, as though they would be in the line of fire of this projectile, thus having their own skull crushed by the stone. And so the interactive component in this climactic moment of the narrative, as he is killing someone, as we are going to be engaging with them, is fundamentally Baroque, is what makes this figure so engaging and dynamic and appreciable today. Below David, you'll notice we have the harp that he will use in order to soothe, right, Saul, the contemptuous character of Saul, and then the armor of Saul that he refuses to wear because God will protect him in his right. Now, later in the century, we find that Bernini is going to expand this interest in interactivity from a single medium to all of them, as we saw last time with the glorification of the name of Christ with Bocciccio, his pupil, in Il Gesù. So here we have the quintessential example of what his biographer will come to refer to as bel composto. He is commissioned by the Cornaro Chapel, specifically Federico Cornaro, to decorate the family burial chapel and to center it around and illustrate one of the family's most illustrious relatives, that being Saint Teresa of Avila. So in the bel composto, we have the unification of all media, painting, sculpture, and architecture for one narrative goal, for one story, for one end. And in this chapel, all of them are brought together and bare for this beautiful whole, as Baldinucci is going to refer to it. Above, you find in the chapel, we have frescoes of heaven opening up. Again, we find stucco angels literally spilling out into our space. Below, everything centers around an image of Saint Teresa being stabbed in the heart with a flaming arrow by. So just like Bocciccio's The Triumph of the Name of Jesus we looked at, all three are brought to bear for one miraculous vision. We're watching heaven opening up, seeing what we would not be able to see otherwise as mortals, a spiritual vision. That vision is going to begin in the colored marble floor of the Cornaro Chapel with skeletons. So literally the Cornaro family is buried right beneath our feet, and we see them coming alive to witness this, to appreciate what is going to happen to their relative. Above, to the sides of this chapel, you have people that are going to be Cornaro family members and the deceased shown alive, engaging in discussion, looking at and witnessing this miracle that's happening in front of them, while we have a fictive low-relief sculpture that seems to extend out with these massive Ionic order columns and this barrel-vaulted section of a ceiling behind them, of which are looking to the trompe-l'oeil effect, the hidden light source illuminating the ecstasy of Saint Teresa in the center. So you find that Bernini is going to have golden rods behind these figures that are being lit up and illuminated by the light coming from the stained glass from the outside, but you cannot see it unless you climb up onto the sculpture and look directly upward. Now, centering around this massive bel composto and ensemble, you're going to have the most important figural grouping here, two massive over life-size figures, one an angel, the other of Saint Teresa. So we have the ecstasy of Saint Teresa here, where she is going to be experiencing one of her visions that she's famous for, in which an angel of the Lord comes unto her and stabs her in the chest with a flaming arrow in her bosom, in her heart, and he pulls it out and does it again 3 times. Thus she experiences such pain and ecstasy simultaneously that she wants for nothing more than the love of God for the rest of her life. Now, the experience is a mystical vision of having an angel appear unto you and stab you in the chest is very abstract. It is not something you can actually show in literal spiritual terms necessarily prior to Bernini. You find that Bernini, instead of trying to capture someone being very quiet and still on the ground lying by themselves because we would not be able to see this angel appearing only to her, instead he externalizes this climactic moment of the narrative and shows that her spiritual ecstasy is going to equate to physical ecstasy. As her head is going to be tilted backwards, her limbs are languid and limp, falling to her side, her eyes are tilted back in her head, her mouth is open, all signs of physical ecstasy. The indication that we have of what's happening internally is made visible with the deeply undercutting and liveliness of her drapery, of her habit that she's wearing here. That's going to undulate radically and violently, showing how engaged she is and enwrapped in a spiritual encounter internally. But that is the brilliance of the Baroque and Bernini, to externalize this dramatic event, which is entirely invisible to mortal eyes, to the naked eye, but shows us the significance physically and engages with us on a physical level, as we have this composition built around diagonals, showing us the reaction the angel has with his drapery billowing in the wind around the soft, supple forms of this smirking young angel, while the drapery of Saint Teresa, as she's lifted up on a cloud, is agitated in the same way that she feels internally. This lecture will cover the expansion of and exportation of Italianate ideas to the rest of Western Europe. This class especially will look at those controlled by the Habsburg family in Spain and Flanders. In this period, we find Spain, even though they are not as powerful as they were in the 16th century after their defeat, especially of the Spanish Armada, they still do maintain control over an area in northern Europe called Flanders. They still control Spain proper in the southwest, and Sardinia, Sicily, and the Kingdom of Naples. These are going to be ruled over by viceroys. So first we'll look at Spain and the influence that Italy is going to have on Spanish painting in the 17th century, starting in Naples, and then leading us to Seville, the largest cosmopolitan city in Spain at the time, and then finally to the court painter Velazquez in Madrid, who will work on a commission celebrating the battles of the Spanish troops in Breda, as you see here in the north highlighted. Now, the 30 Years' War comes to dominate the political landscape of the 17th century, and continuously we see battles and skirmishes between the 3 major powers, that being France, Spain, and England. These are going to be battles fought over religion, and the religious wars continue in the 17th century. We can certainly see that. But also over the territories in the New World, and who would control them in Central, South, and North America. So it is at this time that Philip IV, who will rule from 1621 to 1665, is the head of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. And he will rule over Portugal and Italy and the Netherlands, the New World, right? Spain proper. They have all of these various areas that he is going to be in charge of. All of these qualities are going to be possessed by the greatest painter in the Spanish Golden Age. That's Diego Velazquez. So Velazquez is going to, in in his work promote this straightforward appeal to the senses, as in an almost virtuoso display, he's able to capture textures very clearly and effectively. And he will become the painter to the king in Spain as well. But first, he needs training in the largest, most cosmopolitan city of Seville, where we also find Zurbaran is from. So while in Seville, he apprentices to his future father-in-law, Francesco Pacheco, at 11 years of age. Now, Pacheco is the only artist in Spain to write a tract or a treatise on the art of painting, publishing it in 1649. So he is very significant. So Velazquez is going to marry his daughter. This is very common, in which you ensure that your profession is carried on by your son and or your wife's son. And so we find that Pacheco positions Velazquez very nicely because he has good relations with the elite, given that Pacheco is the official inquisitor or liaison to the Spanish Inquisition, going to various churches, ensuring that the imagery present conforms to the doctrine set forth by the Roman Catholic Church. So we find that Seville is not a small backwater city. Instead, it's the largest, most cosmopolitan city, given it functions as a port for trade with the Flemish north. Remember, this is where you're going to have the stock exchange founded in Antwerp. And then you have Italian merchants coming over from the east and trade with these eastern peoples all the way to the Silk Road, for instance. And then from the Americas, we see trade coming in. So there is plenty of money and commissions to be had in Seville. So it is here that Velazquez makes his mark with his bodegones, as they are known, or these genre scenes that are specific to Spain. So here we have him demonstrating his affinity for Caravaggesque art as a Caravaggisto, even though he does not travel yet to Italy to see Caravaggio. He knows of his works thanks to other artists who are sending work back to Spain, right? And so these artists are influenced by them with the half-length figures, with a blank background, plebeian types, right? All of this is going to come from Caravaggio. But Velazquez is actually more talented by way of his textual illusionism than Caravaggio was, whereby, influenced by the Flemish tradition and the collections in Spain, you see here that he can suggest the transparency of a goblet of water that beads up on the outside, whereby you also can see the difference in the water jug made of the ceramic material, where water has splashed on it and it's darker, and the water also beads up and reflects in a very believable fashion here. So differentiating the wood of the table from the ceramic jars to the cloak of the water cellar, which is, of course, a poor man's job, right? An unskilled laborer would do this, just as you'll go to Europe today and people are going to be selling bottles of water on the side of the street for tourist attractions. Now, this is also going to illustrate what his father-in-law and the most influential painter, given his association with the Spanish Inquisition, is going to praise at the time, and that being he praises naturalism over the exaggerated style of mannerism, instead preferring natural forms and doctrinal correctness to beauty. So this is very different, interestingly enough, from what we see in Italy, because they will appreciate straightforward appeals to the senses to understand Christianity and man's relationship to God. So we find that they are similar in that we have this appeal still showing you the artist's ability to capture different types of liquids and or textures. It's just that Velazquez has even a greater range of textural differentiation than Caravaggio. Now, turning to how he becomes the painter to the king, he's going to very smartly position himself with the help of Pacheco by painting the entourage and the family surrounding the king, such as the Infante Don Carlos here. And this is how he's going to be made Pintor del Rey, or painter to the king, in 1623, thus becoming the most powerful artist in all of Spain, getting the best commissions to record both the royal family themselves and the great battles that are going to be won by the Spanish military. Now, the most famous painting Velazquez is known for, arguably, is his Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor, of 1656. A massive painting with life-size figures. It's 10 feet tall, 9 feet wide, much like the painting that you see within this painting at the left. So it's painted after his trip to Rome from 1648 to 51, whereby he's going to locate the painting in the artist's studio in Alcazar in Madrid, which is going to be a gift, this painting will be, to the king, not a commission, but a gift from Velazquez, to hang in his personal office. So what do we have here, and why is it called the Maids of Honor? Well, not because this is a wedding, that is a common misconception, but instead because it centers around the only heir to the Spanish throne at this time, the Infanta Margarita. So the Infanta Margarita, or the princess, is going to be dressed in the foreground. She is the focal point of this image, with her ladies-in-waiting, if you will, or the maids of honor, those that are going to attend to her every need surrounding her. One kneels to assist her in getting dressed, as the tiny Margarita is going to be presenting herself as a royal. Off to the side, you have another one of her maids, and then the court dwarves with the family dog off to the side that's being playfully kicked at this time. Behind them, you have a woman dressed in the attire of a widow, with the male member of the Habsburg family accompanying her, for after a woman is going to lose her husband, she cannot go unaccompanied out in public. And finally, in the background, with a backlit black figure here, we have the chamberlain and or the butler stepping in to see what the royal family need. In the background, of course, given that this is for the king's office, and he would see this when he walks in every day, you have not a painting, but a reflection of Philip IV and Queen Mariana in the background, right? Because it is far lighter than the other paintings on the wall. Now, where did they get this idea? Well, remember that Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini wedding is actually going to be in the Spanish collection at this time, with the mirror at the background, and also with an appreciation for textual illusionism and the possibilities of oil painting. So here we must note that on Velazquez's chest, as he is painting, supposedly looking out, right? So he would be looking at the king and queen, painting them, not painting what we see here. So this is a very interesting self-portrait, and also a portrait of the royal family, showing how important he is to them. But on his chest, you have the Order of Santiago's heraldic device, and that is a noble order to which Velazquez appeals several times. So he wants to become a member of the nobility. Of course, the only way to become a noble is to actually be born into nobility. So what he's asking has no precedence. But supposedly, thanks to the intervention of the Pope's recommendation himself, he was given this honor shortly after this painting was completed. And we know that this heraldic device is added later on his chest to the painting. In X-rays, we can tell. So why should he be made a knight? Why should he be made a noble? And the argument we can see in the background very subtly, along with his capturing of the royal family in the foreground and showing how important he is to them and what painting can actually do. He's also going to be showing that painting is an intellectual activity, that it requires a great deal of education, because you must know all of these ancient stories, all of the classical classical myths, for instance. So we have copies of paintings by Rubens, specifically the story of Arachne and Apollo and Midas, both of them mortals who are going to be challenging the achievements of the gods, right? So then Arachne is turned into a spider, and Midas is going to be given ass's ears because they challenge the gods. So at the same time, this is a warning against hubris in this way. But the argument succeeds, and he is knighted. Another artist who's also going to be knighted several times is going to be that of Peter Paul Rubens, who's going to be centered as his hometown in Antwerp, which is the southern region still controlled by. Here we find the circumstances that lead to a very violent and hostile area in Northern Europe, whereby the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is going to give the Netherlands to his son Philip II, who is the King of Spain. Now, this happens in 1554. But Philip II forbids all religion except for Roman Catholicism. And this is the area which is a hotbed of Protestant activity and has the most radical sect of Protestants arguably in Europe, Calvinists. So where Calvinists are then going to, because of the proclamations made by Philip II, riot. They run through cities and churches, destroying religious images and those that remind them of the Catholic Church and the oppressive rule of Philip II and the Spanish. And we find massive religious migration happening at this time. So those who are Protestant move to the north, and those that are Catholic move to the south. This is going to then, after 1579, set up two different federations that eventually are going to become Flanders and the Dutch Republic, or what we would know today as Belgium in the south and Holland in the north. Now, Peter Paul Rubens is born into this very dramatic and volatile situation and is going to be Catholic, as his upbringing suggests. So he's going to be ideally situated to assist the King and Queen of Spain and the Archdukes of Flanders because of his aristocratic education. He's known for creating a Pan-European Baroque style, one which everyone can appreciate throughout Europe, regardless of their background. Thus, as artists in Italy sought to create a style that would bring people back to the Catholic Church through an emotional appeal, so too will Peter Paul Rubens, but bringing together the interest in the classical idealized tradition of the South in Italy, for instance, and bringing that together with the northern penchant for naturalism, but dramatically so. His aristocratic education, probably because his father was intending him to be a lawyer, is going to include the polyglottinous training of multiple languages. So he knew Italian, Latin, Flemish, French, Spanish, English, and more. So this makes him an ideal political diplomat who can go to different royal courts, make paintings for these kings and queens and the royalty, right? And he can speak their language. So he works officially for the royalty of Spain, who controls Flanders and sets up the Archdukes of Flanders. He travels to Italy, as is appropriate for northern artists, up until the 18th century. They are going to travel there to complete their artistic training. For almost a decade, he lives in Italy under the protection of wealthy patrons. So from 1600 to 1608, he studies classical statuary very carefully, taking these studies back. He says very clearly that a painter cannot be a great artist unless he knows instinctually and from the back of his hand antique sculptures and the best examples from antiquity, like the Apollo Belvedere, like the Laocoon, like the Spinario, all of these famous examples in the Vatican collection especially. So he brings that back with him, his knowledge and love of classical antiquity and of idealized heroic forms, and is immediately commissioned for the best painting one could receive in Antwerp, the capital here at the time of Flanders, a massive, massive triptych that is going to be of the elevation of the cross, that you would see 20 steps above the nave, right, that we would see towering over us to give you an idea of scale. So just the wings of the panel are going to be massive and are meant to overwhelm the spectator with their sheer size and monumentality, as we see the first time in history Christ actually being crucified. We do not show him before, nor do we show him after he is dead or taken off the cross. But just as is common for Baroque art in general, it is the climactic moment when he's being crucified, as we see the violence that it would take to lift the cross into place, with women and children crying and screaming off to the side, with the Roman soldiers directing the activity off to the side, but using a Pan-European Baroque style so that everyone can appreciate it, so that we can appreciate the idealized forms that are going to be taken from antiquity, but at the same time, so Northerners can appreciate the specificity of flora and fauna seen here, with even very particular attention paid to a specific type of spaniel down in the lower mid-ground, which is obviously named after the Spanish, right, for their hunting dogs. You have an astronomical event in the background with an eclipse. We have specific foliage behind them. We have a particular type of horse, right? Very particular things that they appreciate in the North. Now, just like the Ghent altarpiece, this would not have been seen merely as panels above the high altar, but would have also had a massive monumental frame that looked like a church associated with it and around it, framing the entire painting and the altar. So just like with the Ghent altarpiece that is closed with fairly monochromatic or achromatic approaches to the paintings in grisaille, and opens up into a very colorful promise of salvation on the interior. We also can see that in the elevation of the cross, where we would have had originally a 35-foot high ensemble with the frame, even larger than the Ghent altarpiece, with additional narrative scenes in a predella below, and then angels flanking God the Father above, and then finally a pelican at the very apex of this frame. This is the single largest work that Peter Paul Rubens, a very prolific artist, will produce. So here we might note first off why we have a pelican, which appears very commonly in crucifixion scenes, nesting above, ripping open a hole in its chest to feed its blood to its young, because they believed that this is how birds actually fed their young, and they mistook the regurgitation, where a bird will lower its head, for actually wounding itself to feed its young. So this is seen as an emblem relating to Christ, because he also has a wound in his side that feeds us, all of his children, and allows us to gain salvation in the next life. Now, the scene is built radically and dramatically around diagonals and counter-diagonals. So we find that the figures off to the left panel are going to be piled up and are looking on in terror and horror, very clearly illustrating how we should feel about this scene, as the Madonna and St. John the Evangelist are in shadows looking on very stoically. In the center, built around a massive diagonal, you're going to have the cross that is being foreshortened once again, as the body is at an angle to the picture plane, as we're going to be bringing the heavy several hundred-pound piece of wood with, again, a full-grown man on it, up into position, lowering it into this hole that they dug, much like a fence post, whereas you have the body of this horse and this Roman soldier giving you the counter diagonal, forcing all of the weight down to that single spot where the cross will. The grouping of figures, these muscular figures piled up one after another, showing you the physical effort and exertion that it would take to accomplish this task, is going to ensure that we appreciate these idealized forms based on the Laocoon, for instance, is what Christ is modeled on, the heroic musculature here, which is tempered also by the careful observation of the different types of animal and plant life that they appreciate in the north. Now, the organization of a diagonal, as we discussed, always ensures that we interpret a scene dramatically and as an action, as opposed to something that is still and stoic and quiet. So we hear the grunting of the men. We imagine the straining and see that in their muscles as they're going to be pushing him up into place. So just to show you what he does, he begins with studies of actual figures that are more believable as far as their proportions are concerned. And then he filters it through antiquity, ensuring that the figures are heroized and or through the filter of the Laocoon and Hellenistic sculpture, we see the heroism of Christ and then the evil physiognomy of the bald executioner with the pointed ears now that was much smaller earlier. Now he's hypertrophied, right, to suggest the violence being done to the body of Christ in this instance. So this comes from the Laocoon, who also throws his head up, opens his mouth, whose eyes are directed to the sky with an arm up, right? So that heroic musculature shows us the quality and character of these individuals, not just what they look like. Now, to compare a crucifixion scene from the High Renaissance versus the Baroque, I give you an example here of Raphael's crucifixion, very commonly after Christ has died. You have angels even collecting his blood for the Eucharist, or the communion, if you will, from the Protestant tradition, whereby you're going to be eating and drinking the body and blood of Christ, right? So, but it's ordered. Everything is built around a composition that is bilaterally symmetrical with Raphael's. You have the same number of angels and saints on each side of the cross, and it is quiet and contemplative. Nothing need ever move. In Rubens' version, it is exactly the opposite. We see the suffering Christ. We feel the pain that he must be enduring as his body weight is pulling against the nails in his hands and his feet, or the weight of the cross that he is on, these figures, all of them heaving violently, trying to get it in position. And finally, we should note that like Bernini's David, that like Carracci's Polyphemus Furioso, it's going to be coming out into our space, engaging with the viewer directly, physically, emotionally. Thus, you must be engaged with this, because when they lower the cross into place, the hole is dug in our space, out in the church itself. So just as Christ will come back as the priest blesses the wine and the sacrament over the altar right below this, so too is he being lowered into place. We literally see him coming into our space, engaging with us. Thus, of course, we must consider the emotional ramifications of those that were thinking of converting back to Catholicism looking at this. Caravaggio does the same thing and uses the same techniques. This is common in the Baroque, to try to engage with the viewer by physically putting things in our space, right? So in his instance, just like with Rubens, the body of Christ is coming out into our space, in this case on the altar as he's lowered into the tomb. So we must consider the physical nature of what we are looking at, because it's coming out at us. Now, if we were to summarize the Baroque as it is going to be adopted in Spain and Flanders, we must first note the interest and effect of Caravaggism or Caravaggismo, whereby artists influenced by the art of Caravaggio appreciate naturalism, plebeian types, right? So very commonly you can understand them as genre scenes for martyr scenes, right? So this is very common and straightforward, right? So you find, secondly, finally, that they're going to continue the Flemish illusionistic tradition that's going to go back to Jan van Eyck that appreciates textual illusionism. And then finally, the exuberant theatricality that celebrates Catholicism in these disputed Protestant areas is going to be more exaggerated the closer we get to the north and the closer we get to people who have different religious beliefs. So in Spain, they need not use this very exaggerated, very dramatic style because everyone is already Catholic. They do not tolerate any other religion. In the north, they're right next to the hotbed of Calvinism and Protestants right here. So we need to ensure that we very overtly are communicating the exuberance of Catholicism to try to convert these people, to change their minds, to show them the emotional appeal of the Catholic faith. This lecture is the final in the series on the 17th century in Europe and follows the developments in Italy and those in Spain and Flanders, with the last two countries we will cover, the Netherlands, or modern-day Holland, and France. These two nations could not be more different in the 17th century, for France would become the hallmark for the age of absolutism with Louis XIV, the Sun King, the pinnacle of the French monarchy as we know it in the early modern era. Whereas in the Netherlands, we have a fiercely independent and democratic set of cities that are Protestant, that are fighting for their independence against Spain, who was going to control Flanders directly to the south. So it is here in the north we have a new interest in art that starkly is going to move away from the standard scenes and subjects that we look at in Catholicism and in Catholic works of art. So finally, in 1648, the Netherlands are officially recognized as the Dutch Republic, officially a separate geopolitical unit from Spain, which had ruled them ever since Charles V had given it to his son, Philip II, the King of Spain. So it is in this area that we have the highest per capita income of all of Europe, here in Amsterdam, thanks largely to the trading routes for which they have access to the North Sea and then the Atlantic and the rest of the world. So we find that these trading routes will take traders and these merchants to North America, South America, West Africa, China, and Japan, as well as the Southeast Asia and Pacific. The power then is not in the hands of the aristocracy in the Netherlands, but instead in the patrician class and or the wealthy upper middle class. These merchants who are going to be greatly benefiting from this trade and their proximity to trading ports. Now, it is going to be here in Holland, as we know it, the Dutch Republic, where the Dutch East India Trading Company is founded in 1602, and the Dutch West India Trading Company is founded in 1621. These two are going to be juggernauts in the naval world and would surpass in many ways the rivals that they had in the English and the Spanish by way of the sheer volume that is going to be traded by the Dutch, even though they are a very small country. And we find that it is this fierce independence that leads to, along with the belief in Calvinism, that leads to iconoclastic riots that break out in the Netherlands that do not in other areas that are that maintain their Catholic identity. So you find that the puritanical ban on religious images established by John Calvin is going to also be allowing the locals in the north to throw off the yoke of Spanish control, of this foreign presence in their land. And so they're showing that they are rejecting both the Catholic Church and the rule of the Spanish by doing this. Now, in place of these religious images like Madonna and Child or crucifixion scenes that we would see in churches, we find that new genres or categories of painting are going to be adopted as the most dominant in the North, and that being portraiture portraiture, landscape, genre scenes, and still lives we will all look at today are going to be explored further in the North, though not entirely unique and not entirely practiced only in the North. They are going to be further expanded on here because they take the place of all of those overtly religious scenes that previously would have been found in homes and churches. Now, the more famous artist in the Netherlands that you may be familiar with is Rembrandt van Rijn. Rembrandt is going to be born actually in the city of Leiden to a miller. It's going to be a middle-class individual and is going to attend in his early education the oldest Protestant university that we have up here. He moves to Amsterdam in 1622 to 23, the winter of, so it overlaps. And once he moves to Amsterdam, that you're familiar with today, a major hub, port city, and a major location for trade at the time, you find that he will specialize in portraiture. And this is where you find most artists in the North have their bread and butter in at least the first half of the 17th century, is portraits, because we need not only portraits of wealthy individual merchants, but also of groups. And we have lots of organizations that want to be memorialized in the North. So Rembrandt does make some private religious commissions, and that's what he wants to be known for. But in fact, this is going to be what most of his work is going to be known for posterity, such as his anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. So the anatomy lesson here, signed and dated in the very back, as you see on this roster wall, 1632, behind the figure that looks out at us, the focalizer in the background, we have the pre-lector to the Anatomy Guild who is lecturing on this corpse. There is an anatomy text open to the far right foreground as he's going to be talking about the nerves in the hand, specifically how the thumb and forefinger are going to function. Now, this is going to be not an actual scene of a lesson that these doctors are going to be a part of, but instead a group portrait recording the people that belonged to the Anatomy Guild. Right, so here, looking on very intently in different positions with the characteristic white lace collars so popular in the 17th century in the North, we find that Dr. Tulp is putting his left thumb and forefinger together, right, as he dissects this corpse of Eris Kent, a man who was executed the day before for stealing a coat. You find that he is demonstrating how we are superior to all of God's creations because of the ability that we have to bring our thumb and forefinger together, which gives us great dexterity. This is his argument that he's famous for as he's lecturing. Now, if we compare this to Frans Hals, you find that Rembrandt does not use the same characteristic loose brushwork. And instead of bringing figures together in a quick, spontaneous way, Rembrandt instead prefers a more dramatic chiaroscuro where they're going to amorphously blend together until we have one solid form, really, of these men in their black coats. And, of course, the nebulous background, much like Caravaggesque tenebroso. So instead of having a unity of a rational attitude that we would say Frans Hals is known for, now we have a unity of space and atmosphere, right? So we have a very subtle chiaroscuro, or light and shade, being used here by Rembrandt as the paintings seem to glow from within. This is what he's famous for. Now, his most famous work is actually also going to be the symbol for Holland today, and is a national work that is relived as a tableau vivant on the Independence Day for Holland every year. And this is going to be what is now popularly known as the Night Watch, but is actually the Company of Friends Banning Koch. So this is the most famous work he produces, and also one of the largest. It's a massive group portrait for the Civic Guard. So the Civic Guard, again, those militiamen that defend a city that are going to be gathering according to the orders of Captain Frans Benninckok, which of course is going to be Dutch for rooster, who holds his left hand out, thus foreshortened, breaking the picture plane, just like the spear of his lieutenant, Willem van Ruytenbroek, with the 16 other members of their company marching to their directions, getting in line in order. Behind them, given the pun on the name of the leader, Kok, you're going to have the small female figure glowing with a chicken leg on her belt. Thus, you have the mascot for this company here, much like you'd have the mascot for a team, for instance, is going to be shown, as the man in red in front of her is going to be preparing, loading his rifle, ramming down the musket ball. And so this unified composition for the great room in the town hall is going to symbolize the readiness, the preparedness, and the ferocity when it comes to defending their freedom and independence that the Dutch want to communicate. They are very, very concerned with maintaining their freedom and liberty. And many of these Puritans make their way to America. Thus, we have Harlem, for instance, in New York, and many of the Puritans settle. So we have this fierce independence that's brought over to the New World as well. They find that the formality, even of Friends' Halls, is even less so here with the Night Watch, named as such because it appears as though the lining up of these troops is happening at night, but in fact it is just darkened over the centuries with layers of varnish. It's actually occurring during the day in this instance. So in the liveliness and the vivacity that we see in Rembrandt, we have the counterpart to that in Johannes Vermeer, a very famous genre scene painter and landscape painter who's going to be working in the city of Delft, known for his very restrained, introspective scenes that seem to have very little narrative urgency or content and don't seem to overtly make social commentary either. We need to rely largely on the viewer to decide exactly what Vermeer is referring to. So his dense subliminal content is what makes Vermeer still appealing today. He does not spell out the meaning and the content of his works. And he spends quite a bit of time on each one of them. So you find that he only produces 36 works that we know of. That is very slow and a very small oeuvre for an artist or body of work. Producing only 2 to 3 works a year compared to Rubens, who was producing dozens and dozens and dozens of paintings a year, up to hundreds sometimes with the help of his assistants. So we find here in an example of his genre painting or genre scenes in which we have a scene of everyday life that also, of course, has moralizing overtones. We give you Woman Holding a Balance from 1664, where a woman is going to be weighing her jewelry with the open jewelry box in front of her, with a Last Judgment scene behind her. And then we find that we are about to weigh these golden jewels. Appropriate because you find that God is about to judge the souls behind him. So the weighing of souls by way of using the symbolism of a scale goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. We see this in books of the dead. So this is going to be a very commonly understood symbol in art, the notion of weighing souls. So this pregnant woman here is, of course, waiting for the judgment of her and the soul of the baby inside her, as she is dressed with a white veil and a blue cloak here, of course, meant to look like the Virgin Mary, who's the intercessor, who is the go-between between us and Christ, so we can pray to her before getting to judgment with Christ, and she can intercede on our behalf. And Vermeer is Catholic, and so is his wife, so it's appropriate that he uses subtle Catholic symbolism, but it is not incredibly overt. And also, we know that he has many children, so many artists would use their wives as models. And so, once again, would this be a portrait of the artist's wife? We are not sure, but it is likely. Now, the interior spaces of Vermeer's, it has been noted by many, look incredibly photorealistic, as though he somehow used an optical device to capture space more convincingly. And, in fact, in the North in the 17th century, any artist, a middle-class artist, could afford one of these box camera obscura constructions, a very simple device with a lens that focuses light into a dark area with a mirror that then reflects the light onto a tracing table above, thus allowing you very easily to reconstruct, much like taking a photograph of a scene, a still scene in front of you. So that's why in his works we find, and in many Dutch artists' works, such as Gerard ter Borch here, we find that not only do we use this type of framing device, but we get a type of photographic sense of stillness here, like early daguerreotypes. Now the frame, if you look at those behind the woman here holding a balance, obviously is significant, thinking of that she's holding a scale and that Christ is judging. We find that in Dutch art in general, you will find that what frames them is going to tell us a lot about the scene, because we do not see, for instance, what the woman here in the parental admonition is thinking or what she's expressing. But we know it has something to do with sexuality, given that there is a bed behind her. Now, let's talk about next example here, in which you find Vermeer carries on, and in the North, many artists carry on that interest in the everyday. So still, we're showing something that anyone could see at the time in an interior space in a home in Delft, such as Vermeer's. Right? This carries on what we were talking about with Quentin Messias and the interest in moving away from overt or literal religious symbolism and having subtle moralizing themes then in their work. The most popular genre, however, in the 17th century, despite the popularity today of genre scenes and us associating the Dutch with genre scenes, is actually landscape. It's going to make up more than 40% of the market share of art that's being purchased and made in the Netherlands in the 17th century in the second half. We find that landscape, as an incredibly popular genre, is not surprising, because the Netherlands, by their very nature, are reclaimed areas of land that were under the water, that were below sea level. So the Dutch were very proud of their newly won land, their new country. The problem with this land is it is incredibly flat, and it is not hospitable by way of the damp, cold climate and the lack of interesting terrain. So you find that they had to make concessions when trying to make interesting landscape, glorifying their newly won land. The most ingenious of these landscape painters and the most versatile is Jacob van Ruysdael. Van Ruysdael is going to produce every variety of category, every type of landscape, sans Italian views that are very popular in Italy for travelers like Canaletto, for instance. Here, in his view of Haarlem from the dunes at Overveen, you're going to have an example of how the Dutch will communicate, much like Altdorfer in Germany, the significance of the landscape, subtly bringing in the notion that this is God's creation and that there is a religious overtone here. We find that here we have the flatlands outside of Haarlem. Obviously, no mountainous regions, nothing that is akin to rapids or waterfalls, but this is an area reclaimed in a landfill. So not incredibly exciting when it comes to the terrain. But what Ruysdael does is give us this immense pressure from the sky above, towering over, with more than 2/3 of the composition made up of it. So we move through with this dramatic lighting and the clouds and the birds above to then indicate the motion and the presence of God. So you'll notice in the foreground, the light is going to come through the clouds and is going to illuminate the mid-foreground where these figures, these industrious figures, go about working. Of course, this is one of the ideal characteristics of the Dutch, is being hardworking, being industrious, right? This then leads us to the open area in the midground behind it in the field to a church. This church then draws our eye upward, where we find these birds are going to be in the clouds. Now, birds, remember, in most religions are going to represent human souls that are going to be freed and flying up to heaven. So here with St. Bavo's Church, we have this industrious approach to Dutch labor and how God is going to be favoring the Dutch, and how because they are righteous and because they are industrious and hardworking and they are not sinful, that he grants them this newly won land for this new Jerusalem for them to carry out the new religion of Protestantism. So this is, of course, meant to be compared, as the Dutch would, to the restoration that God is going to have with the earth after Noah's flood. So you find that the water clears away in the north of the Netherlands through a series of dikes and windmills, which you see here in the background, all of these windmills, which represent, of course, the human soul. The wind, of course, is God directing our path, right? So you find that even though it's not literally a religious scene and it doesn't actually show God, we understand the connotations here and the symbolism as we're bringing in subtly these touches which remind us of Christianity. Now, another type of genre which is popular in the North is that of still life. And still life is going to allow many different types of people to practice, including women. So we find that women artists are going to make their name in this genre, especially because they're largely barred from education in other areas that require knowledge of the male nude. So they're going to be very well known and versed in something that they have easy access to, which would be inanimate objects. So here you're going to have Rachel Ruysch, a very talented and impressive Feinschilder still life painter, who's going to be illustrating for us this imaginative rendition with all of these various flowers blooming simultaneously. So even though, it's important to keep in mind, genre scenes and landscapes and still lives might seem as though they're a record of what actually happened or what something actually looked like, they're always going to be somewhat fictitious. They're not going to be a literal record of history, as we see here, because anyone in Holland at the time, and people in Holland love tulips, for instance, and so they are flower aficionados, they would know that this is not meant to be taken literally, because they know these flowers cannot bloom simultaneously. But it is in this bloom, if you look carefully at these type of still lives, you'll notice that the Dutch are known, these are very small, by the way, generally under 2 feet tall, but they're known for their Feinschilder technique, the fine painting, the ability to include an immense amount of detail in a very small space, coming from the tradition of miniaturist painters and manuscript illuminators like that of Jan van Eyck. So we can actually look very closely at, once again, the legs of a fly and the wings, right, or pomegranate seeds, or individual veins on the leaf of a flower. Now, this is, of course, not just a painting that's meant to be aesthetically pleasing of flowers. Now, flowers generally represent sexual fertility and surrender, and so represent the stages of life as we know it, because you'll notice many of them are going to be beginning the stages of wilting and dying, especially the flowers and the leaves at the left. These insects as well come in, reminding us of the passage of time. So just like the Death and the Matron in Germany we looked at, this is a vanitas, right? So women and flowers are seen to be roughly equated in that they both are prized for their beauty, and then once clipped, once married, in other words, they are going to remain beautiful for a very short time and then wither, wilt, and die. So this is going to, again, take something like the genre scenes and the landscapes we just looked at that seems to be a straightforward representation of what we would see every day, that is not something extraordinary like a religious miraculous scene or a resurrection of Christ. But still it has those moralizing undertones here, so you cannot ever escape the moralizing aspects of art because they always mean something. It's always trying to communicate the values of a civilization. All right, so the brevity of life here can be seen in these still lives with the insects, the various stages of decay in the types of plants, and then the empty snail shell here in the foreground representing the vacant, fleshy shell that we have once our soul is going to leave. Turning to France, we have a very different situation than what we see in the Netherlands, where we have individuals that are celebrating their newfound country and religion. In France, we do not have the ruling system of government being a democracy. Instead, it is quite the opposite. You have absolutist monarchs here, like Louis XIV, who will move the capital from Paris to Versailles. And this is once again to reinforce the fact that he considers himself the Sun King. So Louis XIV, Louis XIV, is going to practice a form of monarchy known as absolutism. He consolidates all of the power that would have been shared with other nobles, other marquises, other dukes, other individuals in France helping him to rule. He takes all of their power and consolidates it, making him the center of the universe in France. Thus, he is the sun around which all other astral bodies revolve. Here we have a portrait of him indicating that rigid and hieratic style he prefers, thus illustrating the control he has over the French state. Just as Hyacinthe Rigaud, the painter here to the king, is going to show us how he has control over his medium, showing us this ermine fur-laced cloak, the crushed wonderful velvet with the fleur-de-lis brocaded on it, the jewel-encrusted sword here with the golden hilt, right? All of which showing us the power of the 63-year-old king who's going to be looking down on us, positioned above us. His elbow points out, separating us from him as his arm is akimbo, right? The richness and the wealth of the king shown in the finery surrounding him in this palace. The fleur-de-lis, just to show you, is going to be traced all the way back to Charlemagne. And like Charlemagne, Louis XIV wants to be a ruler that solely controls a vast empire and wants to consolidate that power for himself and not sharing it with his brother Carloman, such as what Charlemagne did in the first years of his reign. Now, to reinforce the fact that we have a new type of government and a new king, Louis is going to move the capital to Versailles, which was the location for the royal hunting lodge. So you find that any kings who wanted to get out of the city and go hunting, which of course only royalty and nobility can go hunting because you have to own land to hunt the animals on that land. So he's going to transform this forest surrounding this royal hunting lodge into the largest palace that Europe had ever seen. And this becomes the single most expensive commission and architectural undertaking in the 17th century, being built from 1669 to 1685, in which we're going to find 3.5 square miles of raw woodlands is going to be torn down, cut down, and then trees replanted in nice, neat geometric rows. Everything centered around this city here of Versailles, where you'll have, again, the streets that are going to be coming together on the very bedroom of Louis, showing that he is the center of this new world.
where we have 5,000 aristocrats living in the official palace at Versailles, with an additional 14,000 servants and military in the actual palace you see here. There are an additional 30,000 residents in the city of Versailles that still exist today in the southwest part of Paris. Now here is a photograph showing you just how massive this palace is. It's difficult to even get all of it in one photograph, whereby you have this horseshoe-shaped central section, which right in the middle, right on the top floor, you have Louis's bedroom overlooking this vast array of carefully manicured gardens and fountains. And then at his beck and call, right, thousands of aristocrats and servants. In this, you have 700 rooms in all that would be built at Versailles. 551,218 square feet total. A massive palace, right, even by the standards of today. So here we have the area that looks out onto the fountains and onto the gardens, where you would have a very famous gallery, the Galerie de Glace, which is going to overlook these extravagant, carefully manicured gardens. And visiting dignitaries would walk from their entry into the palace down past all of these mirrors in the Galerie de Glace, or the Hall of Mirrors, to the throne room of Louis, thus of course preparing them with this extravagant display of wealth for the powerful king, the most powerful king in Europe, as he would argue at the time. And France's power certainly is going to ascend, making them the capital of the art world by mid-century, and maintaining that status until we get to World War II. Of course, we need to address why mirrors would be so impressive to begin with. So here we have 17 mirror-clad arches, each one made up of 21 individual mirrors. Now you'll notice they are not very large, and that's because at the time this is as large of a mirror that you could make of high quality. So you find that the king had a mirror manufacturing plant moved literally from Venice to an area outside Versailles to do nothing but manufacture these mirrors in order to amaze the visitors that would come see him, because even aristocrats could not afford this many mirrors. This is an extravagant display, a sumptuous display of wealth, very extravagant. But of course, that is not the only room that should amaze us. Charles Lebrun is going to be the head of the French Academy and the main artist put in charge of decorating the entire palace. So every room, we must remember, would have been filled with very luxurious carved furniture, with paintings made to order for those rooms, with Venetian patterns on the walls, ceiling paintings and frescoes on each one. Architectural trompe-l'oeils built in, quadratura painted. Of course, you have chandeliers in every room, tapestries, rugs. So the decoration, we have to imagine, would have been spectacular before the French Revolution and the ransacking by the French people of Versailles. Now, the inside isn't even the most impressive part by way of difficulty in transforming an area, in that we have all of these trees in this area completely leveled to the ground to make way for 200,000 trees that were planted in nice, neat rows. 50 fountains out here for the king and his aristocrats to wander in what they called a golden cage, to entertain them with lavish parties and entertainments so that they would forget that the king had taken away their power. The painter most famous in France in the 17th century actually spent most of his career in Rome, but he was painter to the king for many years and establishes for the French Academy a new style and approach, which we refer to as French classicism. And certainly, Nicolas Poussin was an artist of his day, but the restrained painter-philosopher approach to his art is going to pave the way for art in the next generation we will see. So here, Poussin is going to make his series of landscapes, which he's famous for. Here we have these pendants, which are meant to be seen together, of two landscapes with saints in them, where they're writing their Gospels. So you find that Poussin is going to fall in line with the classical landscape tradition of Annibale Carracci, whereby we find the landscape is ordered to man's will, is rational, is going to unfold predictably in a slow, peaceful fashion. So here, which is meant to be seen in this fashion where the trees frame either side like parentheses, and we have a continuous kind of horizon line in the background, we are going to have the same organization for each one, also adopted from and inspired by Venetian landscapes, but filtered through that of Annibale Carracci, like the flight into Egypt. So we're showing the ordered balance of nature, just as God is revealing his plan through the gospel writers, as we see St. Matthew here directed by the angel in his rendition of the gospel, where we have these classical forms collapsing in the foreground, a meandering river in the midground in an S shape drawing us lazily into the background, where we have another crumbling ancient structure, thus showing us that Christianity is going to surpass and supplant the paganism that came before it in the Greco-Roman era. But the way in which we move through it, as always, begins with the human figures in the foreground, and thanks to the path which is blocked on either side with these massive architectural blocks, we must move through them back to the light area reflected in the midground that twists us around until we get to that architectural structure in the far mid-background, until it opens up into a vast distant mountainous array in the background. The scene, if you are going to look very carefully with Poussin, is going to be anchored around a grid. And so we have consistent verticals and horizontals that are going to halt the dramatic action of the diagonals seen in the center with the river. The same can be said for St. John on Patmos, where you have St. John with his eagle, his symbol behind him, writing his gospel, with the same crumbling ancient structures here, showing that what he is writing will surpass, will supplant these ancient religions, and even, of course, that of ancient Egypt, the wonderful occult-like fascination that they still have with that country then. But again, you'll notice we have the same motion moving through it in an S-shaped fashion until we get to an architectural structure in the midground, leading us up into the background, anchored very clearly by these trees, and then very clearly with these overlapping horizontal lines, which are going to anchor the composition in a very tectonic fashion and make it seem very logical, just like classical landscapes are as introduced by Annibale Carracci, ordered by man's will, sequentially moving back plane by plane, because we can understand the world. It does not overtake us. So this is going to be the model for the type of classical art we're going to see practice in the French Academy once we move past the inspiration that the Baroque is going to leave on the Rococo and move to this rational, orderly approach to the world.